Hi everyone. In this discussion, we're going to talk about the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was very influential among the progressive movement, the social meliorist movement, and in critical theory thought, as well as art and literature. Du Bois graduated from Fisk University. I want to start with that first before I move on to his Harvard study, because Fisk University has a long history as one of the activists of the HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. Fast forward into the 1960s, you've got Fisk graduates who are very active in the civil rights movement, including leadership roles in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. You've got Fisk graduates who are active in sit-ins, Fisk graduates who are active in the March on Washington. You've got Fisk graduates, even still today, that are very, very active in the current present-day wave of the civil rights movement. So Fisk University cannot be overlooked in his influence here. He was also the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. This was 1895. His doctoral thesis also became his first of many influential books that he wrote. You can see his thesis was the suppression of the African slave trade to the United States of America, 1638 to 1870. So again, the suppression of the African slave trade to the United States of America, 1638 to 1870. And even his thesis was important in furthering our understanding of the slave trade. While at Harvard, Du Bois received a fellowship to pursue graduate work at University of Berlin, and while at University of Berlin, he traveled at many universities. He traveled throughout Europe. He got to know some of Germany's finest scholars at the time. He was very much influenced by critical theory, including Hegel and Marx and Engels, the critical theory thought that guides, frankly, the communist thought, the dialectic approach that we talk about in previous discussions. He worked as a professor at several universities: Wilberforce College, the University of Pennsylvania, Atlanta University, now known as Clark Atlanta University. And he was a champion in the use of research and data to address social issues. Remember, Du Bois was a formidable scholar, and he pioneered ways in which we use data and statistical analysis as part of a larger study within sociology to try to look at social issues and social trends and social problems. He was very much a believer that data analysis, statistics, can be part of the civil rights movement. He wrote a book called The Philadelphia Negro. This was relatively early in his life, 1899. While at the University of Pennsylvania, he conducted a study, extensive fieldwork, observations, extensive statistics, data analysis of Philadelphia's 7th Ward, published in 1899 as the Philadelphia Negro. He mapped out within this district, the 7th Ward, documenting familial work and structures. He concluded that the Black community's greatest challenges within the 7th Ward were poverty, crime, lack of education, distrust of those outside the community. Now, a little statement, just so that you guys make sure that you know it, about limitations in study. This was specific to the 7th Ward. When you're doing this type of research, unless you are doing an analysis of data nationwide as well, then the generalizability is limited. That's the nature of this type of study. Generalizability is limited, but still it had a strong effect. Du Bois' drawing on this sort of work remains influential today on the field of urban education within curriculum studies. For instance, in urban education, we tend to look at themes that Du Bois was already looking at: lack of resources, poverty, loss of community, institutions, persistent and racial inequality, the effects of a legacy of inequality. When you're looking at a university that is located in an urban area, such as University of Arkansas Little Rock. Little Rock is a mid-sized American city. Depending on how you define small versus mid-size, it's somewhere in that range. But Even here at University of Arkansas Little Rock, if we're going to look at urban education, which we do look at urban education, we consider ourselves very much of an urban institute, then we do owe a debt to Du Bois. And there's also a recognition in the writings of Du Bois, as well as still today, about the problematic nature of the very term urban, which can, when people use the term urban, signal the use of stereotypes of teachers and students of color related to the conditions and of cultural conflict, racism, and economic oppression. So instead of looking at stereotypes, let's look at the strengths. Instead of looking at the deficit model, let's look at the resources that exist. Du Bois had a very strong influential look at slavery's ongoing impact in many ways. He also, and I don't have it here, he also conducted studies on the Reconstruction period. And he helped to debunk through scholarship the idea that African Americans are the ones responsible for the failure of Reconstruction. Blaming African Americans for the failure of Reconstruction historically was part of the narrative of this lost cause, as the cause of neo-Confederates was uh, trying to make the Reconstruction efforts resisted by the Ku Klux Klan and others seem more noble than it was. Part of what the neo-Confederates were doing was trying to blame the victim, blame African Americans for the failure of Reconstruction. And Du Bois did extensive work on Reconstruction to try to debunk that idea. He also conducted work starting in 1897. He did a series of 4 studies. This was groundbreaking ethnographic as well as statistical sociological work on Black Southern households. One study was conducted in Virginia, 2 in Alabama, and 2 in Georgia that shed light on how slavery still affects the personal lives of African Americans. These studies, like I said, were pioneering work in sociological investigation using statistical analysis. And so when we talk about education today, when we talk about statistical analysis, or we talk about mixed methods to look at social conditions and understand the social conditions of students and families as they might be drawn upon to inform curriculum, we owe a debt to Du Bois as a scholar and as a researcher. He also became known for his concept of the talented tenth, this idea that the African American elite, top tenth, would help strive for civil rights. He was very much of a believer that African Americans needed the chances for advanced education to develop its leadership. Du Bois, as you might recall from another discussion that we've had, clashed very strongly with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was promoting a more conservative approach to progress among African Americans, a more gradual approach that focused on vocational education and vocational training. The idea that elite level education, such as Harvard, in the case of Du Bois, was less needed and less important than vocational education. And civil rights gains, at least for the time being, were less important than getting vocational education so that you have sufficient training for jobs. This clash that Du Bois was having with Booker T. Washington helped to define his work and helped define his career. He was very active in protests. Remember, the protest movement, obviously, that you're seeing today is not new. And the fact that you've got some protesters, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who advocate for a nonviolent resistance to injustice, you would have this situation where sometimes, whether it is outside agitators on the left or on the right, or it is troublemakers and people wanting to break windows who might not even care about the cause of the civil rights movement, or sometimes it might be angry people expressing what Martin Luther King would call the voice of the unheard. For a variety of reasons, sometimes protests do have a violent edge to them as well. Not Booker T, but W.E.B. Du Bois, sorry. Du Bois was very, very active in the protest movement of his day. And in fact, uh, many mainstream members of society considered him a radical and a liberal because of that. Because yes, he was a scholar, and yes, he had a PhD from Harvard, and yes, he conducted very high level research. He was one of the leading scholars of his day, black, white, whatever. He was one of the leading scholars of his day, period. But in all, he also was very, very, very active in the protest movement of his day against lynching, against Jim Crow laws, against unfair labor practices, discrimination in education, as well as employment. And he was also a very strong supporter and advocate of women's rights issues, women's suffrage, women's right to vote, that sort of thing. He was also very much a proponent of gender equity. He helped organize several Pan-African congresses to fight for the independence of African colonies from European powers. And he was very active in anti-colonial efforts to support the interests of Africans as well as Asians. Uh, you might recall the famous words of Martin Luther King, a threat to justice, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Du Bois very much believed in that, and King was drawing on Du Bois in this belief. Du Bois was not limiting himself in his fight for social justice to fight for justice for Africans or African Americans. Remember the colonialism, whether we're talking about the United States colonialism, English, French, Spain, colonialism was having the impact of really robbing many of the traditions and culture and resources and economics of peoples throughout the world in Asia, in Africa, and in the Americas and elsewhere. And Du Bois was very active in shedding light on this, speaking against the harmful impact, the oppressive impact of colonialism. And to this day, there is a branch of study within critical theory called post-colonial studies or anti-colonial studies, linked to the field of colonial studies within critical theory, where you take a look at oppressive conditions and oppressive environments, both physical as well as in dialogue and mindset and economic resources and discourse that takes place that is grounded in colonialism, grounded in colonial power structures, colonialistic power structures. And within the field of curriculum theory, you take a look at how this colonialistic power structures need to be critiqued, that exist to this day, need to be critiqued and questioned and shed light upon and overturned. And so Du Bois's work in that area early on was formative in what has now become the post-colonialist and anti-colonialist realm of study in critical theory as it impacts curriculum studies. He was co-founder of NWCP, along with Ida B. Wells, the great journalist and campaigner against lynching. And he was not the only one. It was co-founded in February 12th, 1909. He was also a primary editor for organizations such as the journal Crisis. Crisis is the journal of NAACP. He was very active in the NAACP. He had at times a difficult relationship with NAACP for a variety of reasons, including honestly whether or not he is a little bit too leftist or liberal for the comfort of some other leaders in the NAACP, because eventually he became more and more active within the communist movement. But it was not until 1948 that he eventually cut his ties to the NAACP. By the time it was 1948, he would have been 80. He had a very long life. In 1944, again 76 right now. He represented the NAACP at the first meeting of the United Nations. He was, like I said, he was very active and very well known in his day as a scholar and as an activist, both domestically as well as internationally. He became increasingly interested in communism and international issues. He believed that capitalism was a primary cause of racism. I notice here I say a, not the. There's a difference between those two, so don't get me confused. It would be absurd to say that it's the only, but it's a cause of racism. And in thinking that, he was drawing upon, remember, his study, his PhD at Harvard took him to Berlin, and he was very much influenced by German critical theory. He was very much influenced by dialectical materialism, as understood by Marx and Engels. Dialectical materialism it basically is the examination of how an economic system, such as capitalism, drives the control and distribution of goods and services. And in the interpretation of dialectical materialism, which Du Bois very much drew on, capitalism is an inherently oppressive system. You have the owners of the means of mass production, the elites that oppress the people who do not own the means of mass production. And you've got to study that oppressive relationship between the two to also understand philosophical ideas and civil rights movements. And ideas are part of this, a part of the ecosystem, if you will, of understanding how this dialectical materialism operates. But driving it all is material production, according to the dialectical materialism approach. This drew upon dialectics with Hegel, a study of the way that two opposites interact to forge a new phenomenon. To understand how mental processes interact. So if you're going to understand mental processes, including racism, you also have to understand in the dialectical approaches the way that the economic system is contributing to the shaping of those mental processes. Du Bois was also known for classic work called The Souls of Black Folk. This was basically a collection of essays and collection of scholarship, given the fact that Du Bois was such a prolific writer and a beautiful writer. This was highly influential. This was a groundbreaking work of Du Bois. The opening sentence, and quite an opening sentence here, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He was drawing on Frederick Douglass in saying this, and it's really from The Souls of Black Folk that the term color line became popularized. The term represents injustice of the separate but equal doctrine prevalent in American social and political life. Separate but equal schools, separate but equal living conditions, and all that stuff. And of course, what this book did is it blew the myth of separate but equal wide open. Yes, it's separate, but it sure is not equal. Like I said, this was basically a collection of sociological essays. It's from The Souls of Black Folk that we get the term double consciousness, which is to this day deeply influential in sociological thought, in literature, literary, in protest thought. You really have to understand this, and it's influential even in curriculum studies, curriculum theory. Double consciousness is the idea that African Americans are required to consider not only their view of themselves, but also the view of the world has upon them. This in particular, white. So if you're African American, what do I think about myself? But what do white people think about myself too? And it's this constant thing, and it's a source of friction. It's a source of hardship, a source of pain. This double consciousness. And like I said, he was very influential in many ways. This is not the only source of influence of him, but civil rights activism, literature and art, sociology, including data analysis, post-colonial studies, which is very influential on critical theory as it impacts curriculum studies today. Again, post-colonial studies basically consists of studies that shed light on structural inequities and systemic racism that are grounded in colonialism and how this impacts schools. And he was very influential on urban education. Okay, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.